Get the hell up, you piece of trash. We don't have all day. Let me check what the hell you're hiding. Get your damn hands off me!
Get your damn hands off me!
Get up already, you useless woman. We don't have all day. Sergeant Clark Matthews said this while lightly kicking the cell bars with his boot, the metallic sound echoing through the corridor of the women's detention unit of the Central Criminal Court in New York. The 42-year-old woman inside the cell was sitting on the concrete bench, her head slightly lowered. She wore the standard orange jumpsuit with no visible belongings, her dark hair tied in a simple bun. She stood up without hurry. "How long are you going to drag your feet?" Clark said, opening the cell with his key. "I told you to get up." "I am getting up," the woman said, her voice calm. "Talking back now?" Clark stepped inside the cell and stood half a meter from her, using his height to make the space feel smaller. "You know what happens to people who talk back?" The woman didn't respond. "That's right." He grabbed her arm harder than necessary and turned her around. "Hands behind your back." Officer Ryan Santos stood at the cell door holding the handcuffs, 29 years old, his eyes shifting between the woman and Clark with the attention of someone learning how things work by watching those who have been there longer. "Tighten them," said Clark. Ryan tightened the cuffs more than necessary. The woman made no sound, but Clark saw the tension in her neck when the metal bit into her wrists. "Very good," he said. "That's how it works." He led her out of the cell by the elbow, with the firmness of someone moving an object from one place to another, and began walking down the corridor toward the exit. "Look at that hair," Clark said loudly enough for the other officers in the corridor to hear. "Going to court like that, all messy." Ryan laughed. "You think the judge cares what she looks like?" Ryan said. "The judge doesn't care about anything." Clark pushed the woman lightly forward. "Only cares about paperwork. She could walk in naked and they wouldn't even notice." The woman kept walking without reacting. "Hey." Clark pulled her elbow, forcing her to stop in the middle of the corridor. "I'm talking about you. Can you hear?" "I can," she said. "Then answer when people talk about you. Where are your manners?" "Sorry," she said in the same tone as before. "Sorry." Clark let go of her elbow dismissively. "Look at that. So delicate." He turned to Ryan. "These are the worst ones, the quiet ones who think they're above everyone." "Above what?" Ryan played along. "Above nothing." Clark resumed walking, pushing her lightly from behind. "She'll get to court smelling like a cell and pretending she has dignity." They reached the exit area where a patrol vehicle was waiting. Clark opened the rear door with more force than necessary and placed his hand on the woman's head in a gesture that was supposedly to keep her from hitting the frame, but carried enough force to hurt. She got in. The door slammed. Across the parking lot, a security camera captured the exit angle. There was another internal camera in the corridor that had recorded everything since Clark kicked the cell bars. There was a third inside the vehicle, installed 48 hours earlier by request of a warrant that had passed through the system under a case number no one had paid attention to. The drive from the detention unit to the Central Court took 23 minutes in morning traffic. Clark was driving. Ryan sat in the passenger seat, slightly turned so he could look at the woman through the metal divider. "What's the charge?" Ryan asked casually. "Fraud," said Clark. "But look at her. Looks more like trafficking." "Yeah, it does. When they're not dealing, they're stealing." Clark gestured impatiently at traffic. "Whole family like that, you can be sure." The woman looked out the window. "Hey," Ryan tapped the metal divider. "I'm talking about your family." She didn't respond. "You know what contempt is," Ryan said. "I can charge you with contempt if you don't respond when I speak." Contempt requires that I insult or disobey an order, the woman said, without taking her eyes off the window. Remaining silent is not contempt. Clark and Ryan fell silent for a second. Look at that, a lawyer, said Clark. Knows the law. I've read a little, she said. Read a little. Clark gave a short laugh. Arrested for fraud and knows the law. How does that work? He looked at her in the rearview mirror. Did you read it inside? Or did you come in already knowing legal stuff? The woman didn't respond. Silence again. Clark slapped the steering wheel with his palm, not out of anger, but with the gesture of someone demonstrating control. Let me explain how it works. You're going to court today. You'll sit in the defendant's seat. The judge will look at you for 2 minutes and send you right back. That's it. No law helps you. No lawyer fixes anything, nothing. He paused. That's your life now. Clark, Ryan laughed. Stop, you're being too nice. True. Clark looked at her again in the mirror. Kindness is wasted on this type. The vehicle stopped at a red light. In the back seat, the woman kept looking out the window with that same calm that had irritated Clark from the beginning. The kind of calm that doesn't match the situation, and therefore suggests the person knows something you don't know, which, for someone like Clark, is the most irritating thing there is. Hey, Clark said, turning his head toward her while the light was still red. Look at me when I talk. She turned her face toward him. Do you think you're getting out today? He said. I don't know what will happen today, she said. You don't know. He laughed. I do. You're going back tonight. Tomorrow morning I'll pick you up again. The day after, too. As long as the case lasts. He turned back to traffic as the light changed. And every time I come get you, it'll be just like today. Understand? The woman looked at him for a second. I understand, she said. Clark accelerated. 10 minutes later, the vehicle entered the Central Court parking lot. Clark stopped in the reserved area, turned off the engine, and opened the rear door with the same gesture as before. Get out! The woman stepped out carefully, her movements restricted by the handcuffs, and stood beside the vehicle while Clark held her by the arm. Look at this classy woman, he said to another officer passing through the lot. Going to court today. The other officer didn't respond, just kept walking with the expression of someone who prefers not to get involved. Clark led the woman through the side corridor of the courthouse, the internal path that connects the service entrance to the hearing rooms. It was a narrow corridor with gray linoleum flooring and fluorescent lights that buzzed softly. The walls had that shade of white that turns yellow over time without anyone deciding to repaint. In the middle of the corridor, Clark stopped without warning and shoved the woman against the wall with an open palm on her back. Wait. She remained still against the wall. Ryan walked to the small window at the end of the corridor to check something on the paper he was holding. Clark stayed beside the woman, closer than necessary. You know what irritates me about you, he said quietly. That look like you're above everything. She didn't respond. You're not above anything. He looked at her for a second. You're a case number, just like all the others I've brought through this hallway. She remained silent. Clark did something that wasn't calculated, wasn't planned. The kind of thing that happens when someone has spent years doing something in spaces without witnesses and completely lost their sense of limits. He spat on the floor next to her foot and said, "Move!" Ryan returned with the paper. He hadn't seen. The woman looked at the floor for a second. Then she looked at Clark with that same calm as before. Intact, without anger or tears, just the attention of someone registering everything. And she walked. Courtroom 7 of the Central Criminal Court had capacity for 40 people, dark wooden floors, and an elevated judge's bench at the back that stood empty at that moment, waiting for the session scheduled at 9 o'clock. It was 8:52. Clerk Patricia Hayes was organizing the case files on the side table with her usual focus. 41 years old, short hair, the kind of professional who knows every procedure of every hearing before the judge even arrives, because that's what keeps the room functioning. When Clark entered with the woman through the side corridor, Patricia looked up from the files. And did something Clark did not expect? She smiled, not with the formality of someone greeting a detainee being escorted, with the kind of smile reserved for someone you know. Clark ignored it. He led the woman to the bench designated for defendants and detainees on the left side of the room and moved to push her down to sit. The woman didn't sit. "Sit down," said Clark. "I'll sit here," she said, nodding toward a different chair in the center of the room, near the case table. "That's not your place." "Today it is," she said. Clark looked at her with the expression of someone deciding how much force would be necessary to resolve the situation. "Ma'am," he said, with false patience that was about to run out, "the defendant's bench is over there. You sit there, or I'll sit you there." "Sergeant Matthews," said Patricia from the records table, her voice completely different now. Clark turned. "What is it?" "You can remove her handcuffs, please." Clark looked at the clerk. "Excuse me?" "The handcuffs." Patricia stood up with the case files in hand and walked toward the central table. "You can remove them." "That's not procedure. The detainee remains." "Sergeant?" Patricia's voice carried something different now. It wasn't the authority of a clerk over an officer. It was another kind of authority, the kind that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't yet know. "Please." Clark stared at her for a second, calculating how far he could go. Then he stepped towards the woman and removed the handcuffs with more force than necessary. The woman slowly moved her wrists, checking circulation. Prosecutor Andrew Miller had entered through the main door of the courtroom with a folder under his arm and stopped when he saw the scene. 46 years old, gray suit, thin-framed glasses. He looked at the woman in the center of the room with an expression that Ryan, watching from the corner, couldn't fully understand. "Judge Lawson," said the prosecutor, his voice lower than intended. Ryan looked at him, then at the woman, then back at the prosecutor. "Excuse me?" said Clark, who had heard. The prosecutor didn't respond. He walked to the prosecution table and stood there, looking at the woman with that expression, more surprise than anything else. The woman stood in the center of the room. Then she walked to the case table, where Patricia had placed a dark blue folder, and opened it with the ease of someone checking her own working documents. "Are these the files?" she asked, flipping through them. "They are," said Patricia. "Complete, as requested. Case 0847 against the state," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Everything is here." Clark stepped forward. "Hey." His voice had lost some of its earlier volume, not because it had become more polite, but because there was a new variable in the room he couldn't classify. "You can't touch those files. These documents are—" "Sergeant Matthews," said the woman, without looking up. "You may wait in the hallway." Clark froze. "Excuse me?" "The hallway." She closed the folder and looked at him. "You and Officer Santos can wait outside while the session is prepared." "I don't take orders from—" "Patricia," said the woman. Patricia walked to a wooden cabinet in the corner of the room, opened it, and removed something she folded over her arm as she returned. It was a robe. Black, with the folds that identify the position, with the embroidered seal on the chest that only judges wear. Patricia opened it and held it by the shoulders. The woman turned around, slipped her arms into it, and Patricia adjusted the folds with the movements of someone who had done it hundreds of times. When the woman turned back, there was no longer any ambiguity about who was in the room. Clark stared at her. Ryan stared at her. Prosecutor Miller, from the prosecution table, stared at her with the expression of someone who had almost understood what was happening, but was still processing the full extent. Judge Jennifer Lawson, federal judge with 18 years of experience, walked to the elevated bench at the back of the room and sat. She looked at the two officers for a moment. "You may sit," she said. Neither of them moved for a few seconds. Ryan sat first, automatically, the witness bench closest to him. Clark remained standing in the center of the room, staring at the bench, reorganizing in real time everything from the past hour. "Sergeant Matthews," said Judge Lawson, "you may sit." He sat. "Before we begin the hearing of Case 0847, she said, her voice now fully restored to the professional tone of a judge, without any trace of the contained tone from earlier, "I will enter the following into the record." She opened the folder and picked up a pen. This hearing was preceded by a conduct verification operation conducted by this court, authorized by the Regional Internal Affairs Division, in response to 3 formal complaints received over the past 6 months against Officer Sergeant Clark Matthews, Badge 4471-8, and Officer Ryan Santos, Badge 6203-2. Prosecutor Miller opened his folder and began taking notes. "Patricia, please record that the conduct verification hearing began at 8:56 a.m., said Judge Lawson. "Recorded, Your Honor." "Your Honor," Clark repeated under his breath, almost to himself, testing the weight of a word that had been in the same room with him all morning without him knowing. "Sergeant Matthews," said Judge Lawson, looking at him. "Do you have anything to say?" Clark stared at her. "You were," he began. "I was in the custody holding unit since 6 a.m., she said. "With authorization from the correctional system and sealed identification by court order." She looked at him. "The procedure was approved for conduct verification purposes in a real situation, not simulated." "Real situation," Clark repeated. "That's right." She opened the folder to the first documents. "I will now read the record of the 3 complaints that led to this operation, for the record." Prosecutor Miller continued writing with the attention of someone aware he was witnessing something that would be referenced for a long time. "First complaint," said Judge Lawson, reading aloud. Dated March 4th of this year. Detainee Rosanna Rivera, 42 years old, held pre-trial on drug charges, reports that during transport from the detention facility in Brooklyn to the federal courthouse, she was pushed against a corridor wall with enough force to cause bruising to her right shoulder, documented in the attached medical report, and that she received racially degrading comments during transport. Officers responsible: Sergeant Clark Matthews and Officer Ryan Santos. Silence. Second complaint, she continued. Dated June 19th. Detainee Marcus Owens, in transfer for a custody hearing, reports systematic verbal abuse during transport, including explicit threats regarding what would happen if any complaint were filed. Witness: correctional employee Andrew Sakata, who overheard part of the statements from the exit corridor. Officers responsible: Sergeant Clark Matthews and Officer Ryan Santos. Ryan had gone very still in the witness seat, hands on his knees. Third complaint, said Judge Lawson. Dated September 2nd, 2 days before this hearing. Detainee Constance Alvarez, 61 years old, in transfer for sentence review, reports receiving a strike to the back of the head during transport from the corridor to the vehicle, and that when she responded verbally, she was threatened with an additional contempt charge. Officers responsible: Sergeant Clark Matthews and Officer Ryan Santos. She closed the folder. Today, during the transport of the detainee identified in the records as Maria Fernandez, which was the sealed identity used for this operation, the following behaviors were recorded by cameras installed in the detention corridor, inside the vehicle, and in this courthouse corridor: use of excessive force in applying restraints, pushing against the wall, degrading language throughout transport, and an act of spitting in the courthouse corridor. Clark opened his mouth. "Sergeant Matthews," said Judge Lawson before he could speak. "When I want to hear from you, I will ask. For now, I am entering facts into the record." He closed his mouth. "Patricia," she said, "please call Detective Ferreira. He is waiting in the hallway." Patricia walked toward the door. Detective Ferreira entered. 56 years old, in uniform, white hair, with the expression of someone who had been called into a situation and was still assembling the full picture of what he had found. He had received a call 30 minutes earlier asking him to come to the federal courthouse regarding a matter involving his team. No details had been given. When he entered the room and saw Clark and Ryan seated, the robe, the bench, the elevated chair, he stood still for a second. "Detective Ferreira," said Judge Lawson, "thank you for coming. You may sit there, please." He sat. "I will summarize what is happening, since you have just arrived." She closed the folder. "Two officers under your command conducted a custody transport this morning that was monitored by cameras as part of a conduct verification operation authorized by Internal Affairs. During the transport, behaviors were documented that constitute institutional violence, abuse of authority, and potentially criminal torture under federal law." The detective looked at her, then at Clark, then back at her. "Your Honor," he said, his voice careful, measuring each word, "may I ask who the transported individual was?" "You may." Judge Lawson looked at him. "It was me." The silence that followed did not need to be long to be absolute. It was the silence of an entire room absorbing the same information at once, with no one having anything sufficient to say. The detective looked at her for a long second. "Understood," he said, his voice stripped of all official cadence, carrying only the weight of what he had understood. "Sergeant Matthews," said Judge Lawson, "do you have anything to say before I proceed with the determinations?" Clark stood up. There was something in the way he stood that was different from when he had entered the room. It was no longer the posture of someone in control, but it wasn't yet the posture of someone who had completely abandoned arrogance. It was the posture of someone calculating how much he could still sustain. "Your Honor," he said, his voice lower but not lacking conviction, "I understand the seriousness of the situation, but I need it to be considered that in 15 years of service, I have never had a disciplinary case concluded against me." "Concluded cases," Judge Lawson repeated, "not cases initiated." Clark remained silent for a second. "There have been cases initiated that were dismissed," he said. "For lack of evidence?" "Or for lack of proper investigation," she said. "Which is precisely why this operation was conducted the way it was." She looked at him. "Do you want to argue that the behavior documented on camera this morning was appropriate?" Clark remained silent. "I am not arguing that," he said. "Then what?" "I'm saying there is context, that the work we do is difficult, that detainee transport situations are unpredictable, that sometimes the tone we use—" "The tone." Judge Lawson opened the folder again and turned to a specific page. "At 7:42 a.m., you said. and I am reading from the camera transcript. If it were up to me, you wouldn't be setting foot here. At 8:14, inside the vehicle. Whole family like that, you can be sure. At 8:26, in the courthouse corridor, you pushed the detainee against the wall, and at 8:31, you spat on the floor next to her foot. She closed the folder. Is that tone, Sergeant Matthews? Clark stared at her. Your Honor, Is that tone? She repeated. No, he said after a second. No, it is conduct. It is a pattern. It is what 3 different detainees described across 3 different months, and what was systematically minimized until it became necessary to document it personally. She looked at him with the same calm she had carried all morning, the same calm from when he pushed, the same from when he spat, intact, like something beyond his reach. You may sit. Clark sat. But there was still something in the way he sat, a rigidity in his shoulders, a chin not fully lowered, that showed the arrogance had not been dissolved, only pressed inward by circumstance. Officer Santos, said Judge Lawson. Ryan stood. He was different from Clark from the beginning. Younger, with the expression of someone living the consequences of something he had followed, without fully calculating where it would lead. There was something different in his eyes. Not necessarily better, but different. Less conviction, more discomfort. Do you have anything to say? Ryan was silent for a moment. I don't have an excuse, he said. Judge Lawson looked at him. I don't, he repeated. I knew it was wrong. Not all day, not from the beginning. But at some point in that hallway I knew. And I kept going because it was easier than stopping. Why was it easier? Because Clark was in front of me. Because he always has been. Ryan looked at his own hands. 3 years working with him. That's how I learned things worked. And now? Now I know I learned wrong. The room fell silent. Prosecutor Miller had stopped writing. Detective Ferreira had his hands on the table, staring at a distant point. Patricia continued recording with her usual focus, but there was something different in the rhythm of her typing. Slower, aware of the weight of what she was transcribing. You may sit, said Judge Lawson. Ryan sat. She remained silent for a moment, looked at the files, looked at the detective, then looked at the 2 officers. I will now proceed with the determinations, she said. First, immediate removal of both officers from detainee transport duties, effective immediately. Second, initiation of internal disciplinary proceedings by Internal Affairs based on the evidence recorded in this hearing, including audio and video transcripts. Third, referral to the District Attorney's Office for evaluation of criminal charges regarding documented acts of physical abuse, specifically the push against the wall and the act of spitting, which may constitute torture under applicable law. Clark opened his mouth. Torture, he said, and even now there was a trace of disbelief. Not about the act, but about the classification. Under federal statute, said Judge Lawson. Subjecting a person in custody to physical or mental suffering is punishment, provocation, or discrimination. She looked at him. The district attorney will evaluate. It is not my ruling, it is my referral. Clark fell silent. Fourth, she continued, mandatory participation in a police conduct requalification program lasting 6 months, conducted by the Police Academy. The program includes modules on human rights, proportional use of force, and professional ethics. The program restarts from the beginning, as if participants were new recruits, regardless of years of service. This includes both practical and theoretical evaluations that must be passed before returning to active duty. From 0, said Clark, his voice now stripped of its last trace of conviction. From 0, confirmed Judge Lawson. 15 years of service, and I have to go through recruit training. 15 years of service with 3 abuse complaints in 6 months, she said. The training is not punishment for time served. It is recognition that something learned during that time must be relearned. Clark remained silent. Detective Ferreira, she said, the determinations will be formally forwarded to Internal Affairs and to your unit command by the end of the day. I need confirmation of receipt by tomorrow morning. Confirmed, Your Honor, said the detective. Prosecutor Miller, have you received a copy of the case file? I have, said the prosecutor, and I will request full access to the recordings by the end of the week. Patricia will provide it. Already in process, said Patricia. Judge Lawson looked at the 2 officers one last time. Sergeant Matthews, Officer Santos. She spoke both names clearly. This morning, you transported a person in state custody. That person was your responsibility. The law says that means protection, not that it gives you the right to do whatever you want because no one is watching. She closed the folder. Someone is always watching. Sometimes it's a camera. Sometimes it's another detainee who will report it. Sometimes it's me, sitting in the back seat of your vehicle. The session is adjourned. You may leave. Clark and Ryan walked out through the side corridor. The corridor had the same yellowish lighting as when they had entered, the same gray linoleum floor, the same yellowed white walls. But there was something different now, not in the corridor but in the people walking through it. Ryan walked in silence for a few steps. Then he stopped. Clark stopped too. Clark, Ryan said, that's all. Don't. We need to talk. Not now. When? Clark stared ahead at the corridor without answering. I said I learned wrong, Ryan said. I said that in there because it's true, but I also learned from someone. He looked at Clark. 3 years watching you do this. I never questioned it. That's my problem too, I know, but it's not just mine. Clark remained silent. I didn't do anything wrong, he said after a moment. And there was something different in that sentence. Not the arrogant conviction from the detention corridor, not the calculated defense from the courtroom, but something closer to someone trying to convince himself. What I did is what I've always done. If it was wrong, then it's been wrong from the beginning. It was, Ryan said. Clark looked at him. It was, Ryan repeated. And I needed a federal judge sitting in the back of our vehicle to understand that, which says something about me that isn't good. He picked up the folder he was carrying and walked toward the exit. But at least I understood. Clark remained standing in the corridor for a moment after Ryan turned the corner. Then he left, too, down the same corridor, over the same gray floor, under the same yellow lighting, but with slower steps than when he had entered. In courtroom 7, Prosecutor Miller remained after everyone had left to speak with Judge Lawson, while she removed her robe with Patricia's help. Jennifer, he said, with the informality of someone who had known her for years. You knew you were taking a big risk doing this the way you did. I did. If they had gone further. If something had gotten out of control in the corridor or in the vehicle. There were cameras at every point. There was an internal affairs agent in the detention parking lot and another in the courthouse parking area that I could alert with a code at any moment. She folded the robe and handed it to Patricia. I was never without an exit. But they didn't know that. No. She looked at him. And that's exactly what needed to be documented. Their behavior when they believed there would be no consequences. The prosecutor remained silent for a moment. The previous complaints, he said. Why weren't they enough? Because they were detainees' words against officers' words. She picked up the folder and placed it under her arm. You already know how that works? I do. He looked at her. And now? Now there are cameras, transcripts, the record of this hearing. She walked toward the door. Now it works differently. She left. Judge Jennifer Lawson left the federal courthouse at 11:42 through the main entrance, folder under her arm, phone in hand, checking messages with the focus of someone whose schedule hadn't stopped just because she spent the morning in a detention bench. On the sidewalk, she paused for a moment. The New York sun was high and direct. That kind of morning sun that shows no mercy and offers no apology. The city around her carried the normal noise of a weekday. Buses, horns, conversations she didn't hear, but that formed the background of anything happening in New York at any time of day. She stood still for a second. There was something in that pause that wasn't rest and wasn't celebration. It was the kind of pause that happens when someone does what they believe is necessary and is internally checking whether it was done the right way. Rosanna Rivera, Marcus Owens, Constance Alvarez. 3 people who had described the corridor, the vehicle, the tone, the pushes. 3 people who had put their names on formal complaints, knowing it likely wouldn't be enough. 3 people who had done what they could with what they had. Judge Lawson had done what she could with what she had, which was different, because what she had was different. And that difference, she knew, was part of a larger problem that no camera and no conduct operation fully resolves, but that each one pushes a little further in the right direction. She picked up her phone and called her office. I need you to schedule a meeting with Internal Affairs for Thursday morning. She started walking. And send a formal request to the Public Defender's Office asking for a review of the cases of the 3 detainees listed in Case 0847. I want to know if there was any impact on their cases resulting from the complaints they filed. I'll take care of it, Judge, said the voice on the other end. One more thing. Go ahead. The requalification program I ordered for the 2 officers. I want updates every 30 days, not a formal report. Direct call from whoever is running it. Understood. She hung up. She kept walking down the courthouse sidewalk, sun overhead, folder under her arm. Just another person in the flow of a weekday in New York that doesn't stop for anyone and doesn't need to. But there was something different about that day, or at least the possibility of something different, which is not the same thing, but is where it begins. And sometimes that's enough to keep going. 6 months later, Officer Ryan Santos began the conduct requalification program at the police academy with a rookie registration and the recruit uniform he had last worn 10 years earlier. He sat in the front row of the classroom. Not because he had to, but because he had decided that if he was going to do this, he would do it properly. The human rights module began with a video. It was footage of a detention corridor. Yellow lighting, linoleum floor, a detainee being escorted by 2 officers. No identification of anyone involved. Ryan recognized the corridor before recognizing anything else. The instructor paused the video. This material was provided by Internal Affairs for training purposes, he said. We're going to analyze each moment of this scene from the perspective of protocol, law, and professional ethics. Ryan stared at the paused screen. Then he opened the notebook he had bought specifically for the program, the kind of notebook he hadn't used since training, and began writing. Sergeant Clark Matthews had refused the program in the first week, claiming the court order was under appeal. The appeal was denied. He was notified to attend in the second week. He attended, sat in the back of the room, and spent the first class staring at the ceiling. In the second class, he looked at the board. In the third, he asked a question. It wasn't the kind of redemption you see in movies. Clean, complete, accompanied by music. It was the uncertain, uneven beginning of what happens when someone who has spent decades believing in a certain version of themselves begins, by force of circumstance, to consider that the version might have been wrong. It was enough to begin, it's not always more than that. But it's where everything that changes starts. And if you made it this far in the video, comment judge so I can leave you a heart. Share this to remind everyone that all people deserve respect, and leave a like to support our work. Subscribe to receive more stories like this.